All right. Good afternoon. Hopefully everyone had a chance to get out to lunch. Yeah, just kidding. Me neither. Anyway, today we're going to take a look at Logic Apps. And my name, as Grant said, is Rick Wolf. I'm a solution architect here at Bennett, Adelson. I am part of the information worker practice, and we focus mainly on Office 365 applications and implementations, as well as Power Apps and the whole Power Platform, and some Azure stuff as well. So today we want to take a look at Logic Apps. What are they and what you can do with them, how they're different from Flow or Power Automate, as it's now called, and how they're the same, and how you can move a flow from a Power Automate to Logic Apps. And also we'll talk a little bit about the enterprise development story around Logic Apps. So Logic Apps give you the ability to schedule, automate, orchestrate tasks and business processes and workflows across systems, across services within your enterprise, or even across enterprises. And those systems can be either in the cloud or on-premise. Logic Apps has a visual designer, much like Power Automate, allows you to create workflows using various connectors and actions. There's hundreds of connectors available. I think the current number is up around or maybe even above 300 connectors for all sorts of systems, cloud systems. There's also connectors for SAP, IBM, for enterprise systems. So why use Logic Apps? Well, first of all, they're very similar to Flow. They're easy to create using Visual Designer. There's a lot of templates, again, just like Flow, a lot of templates to start from. You can connect various systems, again, both on-prem and in the cloud. It has first-class support for enterprise integrations and B2B. You can access resources inside your virtual networks. You can also access your on-prem resources through a data gateway. They're easily extensible with Azure Functions, or you can even connect your own APIs, your own on-prem systems through custom connectors. They're scalable, just like any other Azure resource. You can reuse them across multiple regions and environments. They have a better application lifecycle management support story than Flow does. And they're consumption-based, so you pay only for what you use. And those are the last three are the ones that we're going to kind of talk about more in depth in this talk and some of the examples. So to compare Power Automate flows versus Logic Apps, for Power Automate, the main users are business users or SharePoint admins or makers, people who are Power users who kind of have the ability and the knowledge to go and create their own flows, automate their own processes. For Logic Apps, you're targeted more towards developers or IT pros. Power Apps provide self-service automation and workflows for users. Anyone can, with a Power Apps license, can create their own workflows and automation. For Logic Apps, it's more toward, you're again targeted more towards the enterprise workflows and integrations. As far as design tools go, for Power Automate, you have the browser experience, the visual designer in the browser. There's also a mobile app. For Logic Apps, you have the same or similar visual designer in the browser, but you can also develop with Visual Studio using a visual designer as well in Visual Studio. VS Code, there's some support for developing Logic Apps, but there's no interactive visual designer. You can view your Logic Apps in the designer, but you can't edit them in the designer. So it's really just a text-based editing experience in VS Code. As far as application lifecycle management support, Power Automate, the story is really pretty limited. You have the ability to export and import flows across environments. You can create environments for dev, test, and prod, et cetera, but the process to move those flows from one to the other is a manual export and re-import process. So not the best. For Logic Apps, you can you have support for Azure DevOps. So for deployment, for source control, for testing, automation, all of those things that you really expect to do in an enterprise development scenario, you can do them for the most part in Logic Apps as well. And for the admin experience in Power Automate, you have the Power Automation Admin Center. For Logic Apps, being that it's an Azure resource, you can manage those and administer those in the Azure portal. You can manage the resource groups, connections, logging, monitoring, etc. Licensing. So let's compare licensing across Power Automate and Logic Apps. So if you have an Office 365 license, chances are you also have a license for Flow. Most of the Office 365 plans have Flow included, if not all now. But those licenses do only include the standard connectors. They don't include the premium connectors. There's also a $15 per user per month plan that does include premium connectors. And if you use those connectors in your flow, then you would be required to have that license. There's also, for $40 a month, there's a plan with the new remote process automation functionality, as well as the AI capabilities for flow. And the old P1, P2 licenses are being phased out, but they may still be available to some organizations if you already have them. I believe you're grandfathered in for the next year, I think, or so. They just extended that because of the pandemic. So I think you have a little bit more time if you want to add any additional P1 or P2 licenses if you already have them. For Logic Apps, there's no user licenses required or no upfront cost, since it's an Azure service. It's consumption based, so you pay for only what you use, and the billing is calculated based on the execution of actions and connections inside your flow. So every time it runs, if you have 10 actions in that flow, if all 10 of those actions execute, you'll be billed for each one of those executions. And the prices are pretty reasonable. So it's about 2.5 cents per 1,000 actions. It's about 12.5 cents per 1,000 standard connectors. And if you use the enterprise connectors for SAP or IBM, those are about $1 per 1,000 connectors. So very reasonably priced. And of course, as with anything licensing, your mileage may vary. So take a look at your license agreements and your current plans. Check the current pricing on Microsoft sites. As I said, the Power Automate licenses recently changed. So they switched over to the per user plans. So make sure you look at your current situation when you're trying to figure out pricing. So let's take a look at some examples of how we've used Logic Apps. So simple example, we have on the right side here, we have a cognitive services knowledge base that's used for Q&A for a bot. We had a customer that wanted to also leverage that knowledge base for Yammer. So rather than having to have someone go and find the bot and ask a question to the bot, they would often post the question in Yammer for someone else to hopefully be able to answer. So they wanted to leverage the knowledge base that they had already created. So we created a Logic app that simply monitored the Yammer group. Whenever a question was posted, either a question or something that looked like a question, the Logic app would send that to Cognitive Services, Q&A, if it got an answer back, and the answer had a relatively high confidence level. I believe we used the 80% confidence level for this example. Then it would post the answer back to Yammer. So the bot would answer the question a lot of times before any other user had an opportunity to answer that question. Another example is we've created a tool for provisioning. So this is something that users can use to quickly and easily self-provision Office 365 resources. So the idea here is that there's a Power App front end where users fill out a request, provide the information, the kind of site, the classification of the site, the security requirements, etc., by answering some questions. That information is stored in a SharePoint list. The Logic app fires off when a new item is added to the list, runs through some business rules, and then uses Azure Automation runbooks to go and create and configure the various Office 365 resources based on the user's requirements in the request. Another more complex example, this is one from Microsoft, one of their example Logic apps. This was an e-commerce flow. So you can see that we can chain together multiple Logic apps to create a more complex business process. So migrating from Flow to Logic apps, why would you want to do that? Well, sometimes people create flows, they begin to use them, they become critical to their business operation. And then if that particular user that created that flow happens to leave the organization, their account is deactivated and that flow stops running. So in that case, you know, they would like to try to avoid that. So really IT needs to manage, it's a lot of cases needs to manage, monitor, and maintain those workflows in a more enterprise way, right? Same way you would do with any other application, custom application in the enterprise. You want to be able to control deployment, versioning. You want to, you know, just manage the whole life cycle of that Logic app. And also the licensing can be an issue too, right? So if you have a flow that was created that uses premium connectors, rather than requiring all of your users to have a $15 a month per user license, you could implement that same similar functionality in Logic apps and then use the consumption pricing. So there could be some potential savings there. Moving from Power Automate to Logic apps is a pretty straightforward process. You can export your flow in the flow template or the flow portal to a Logic app template. You create a new Azure resource group in Azure, add that Logic app file that you exported to that template, deploy it to a resource group or using a resource group, and then simply open up that Logic app in the Logic App Designer. And then if this is the first time you've imported that Logic app into that particular resource group, you probably will have to create the connections that it requires. Once you do that, you don't have to do that the next time you deploy it to that resource group. And connections are unique, specific to each resource group. So you could have separate resource groups for production, for test, for dev, and then have different connections for each of those. So you can connect to different systems. Obviously, you don't want to develop and test against production systems, so you could have separate connections for each of those environments and simply deploy that to each of those environments as you would in any other application. Keep in mind that not all connectors are available that in Power Automate that are available in Logic apps. So the button trigger, the approval connector, the notification connector are specific to Power Automate. So you'll have to account for that if you're moving some of those flows with those in them. Okay, quick demo. Let's take a look at a sample that we have. So let's switch over to our browser. So here's the scenario. We have a bot that uses that Q&A knowledge maker, Q&A maker knowledge base for answering questions about COVID-19. So users can ask questions and get responses about symptoms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what the users would like to do is the folks that manage the site they want to be able to monitor the questions that are being posted to make sure that the answers are right, to make sure that they have answers, or if users are asking questions that they don't have answers for, those can be added to the knowledge base, etc. So the way you do that with Q&A knowledge base is through the Azure portal. So you can look at your app insights for that. If we go to the logs, we can look at requests, and then we can run a query, and we get all of the activity for our Q&A Maker database. And in here somewhere, let's see, we have some, here we go, we have a post, get answer. So somewhere in here is that question and the answer and all of the information. This is not, as you can see, not a user-friendly experience. So what we've done is created a query to extract that information. So we have a query that extracts just the information we're looking for. So here all the questions in the last 24 hours, the questions, the answers, and the confidence score. So this is better, but still users have to go to the Azure portal to do this. So simple solution. This is a flow, Power Automate. We created a simple recurring flow that runs once a week that executes that query to get the questions and answers for the last 7 days and format it as an HTML table. And then we simply email that table to the users so they can review it. And we can take a look here at a sample. So here's the email, here's the HTML table, and also attached is the same HTML file so they can save that off for future reference. So this is the sample flow. So now that it was created as a flow, the users really like this. So now we want to promote this up to Logic Apps. So how do we do that? So let's go back to our slides here and take a look. So we'll just walk through this real quick. So in the design experience, the browser in Flow, you simply select your flow. You can go to the export menu and export it as a Logic App template. Once you export it, you simply go into the Azure portal, create a new resource, which is a template, and then build your own template in the editor. You upload the file you just downloaded from a flow, which contains the definition of your flow, which is this here. And then you simply save it, and then you can publish it or deploy it. You can pick your subscription, your resource group, location, etc., and you deploy it to Azure. Once it's deployed, you can open up that Logic App now in the designer, in the browser, and you'll see that you'll have some orange triangles here that mean that you have some connections that don't exist yet. You need to go and create those connections, and it's simply just adding those connections in the designer, and you're good to go. After you import, you always have to enable because they're always disabled by default when you deploy them. So you simply enable, and it's ready to run. So let's take a look at that same process, but now we're going to do it through Visual Studio. So let's go back to our browser, and here's our flow. We're going to go back to flow. We're going to export our flow, and it just downloaded as a JSON file. So let's switch over now to our Visual Studio, and then we'll create a new project. We're going to create a new Azure Resource Group project. I've already got it pinned over here, so I'm going to click on Next. We'll take the default name, which is Azure Resource Group 6, where we want the source to be, etc. We'll just click Create. And then we'll pick the template that we want to create as part of our solution. So we want to pick the Logic App. We'll click OK, and we have a new template with our Logic App definition and another file for the Logic App parameters. There's also a PowerShell script which is used to deploy this by Visual Studio that you can ignore. These are the two important things, so the Logic App definition itself, the JSON file, and the parameters. So let's go back to our, find our file we just downloaded. And there it is. So we'll open it up. So here's our email Q&A chat log JSON file. We're just going to copy that. And we're going to select all. We'll delete that and we'll paste it into our Logic App definition. So here you can see this is the actual definition for our flow that we exported. You can see that we've got some, here's our action to run the App Insights query. Here's our action that sends the email. You can see this, the to, the subject, etc. Here. So this is the definition, the actual JSON definition of our Logic App. If I wanted to from here now, I could go deploy this. Simply click on deploy. I can pick my account, pick my subscription, the resource group I want to deploy to, the template that I'm using. We only have one in there, and the parameter file for the parameters for this. So let's take a quick look at the parameters. So if we go expand our JSON outline here, we can see that in this Logic App, we have 4 parameters. We have the name, we have the location, and we have the App Insights connection, and the Office 365 connection name. So one of the advantages to creating Logic Apps in Visual Studio is that you have you can add parameters. So for example, in this flow we have the email address that this gets sent to, which is me, is hard-coded in the Logic App itself. So whenever I deploy this, it's always going to send it to me. So in our scenario here, we want to be able to deploy this to a resource group for development purposes and testing purposes, and we don't want to deploy it to our production resource group. So what I can do here is take advantage of the parameters file, and we can add a parameter for email address in this case. And you can also do this for other things too. So imagine that if you're connecting to, say, to a SQL database or a SharePoint list or whatever, you're going to want to have different resources, use different resources in development, test, and production. So you're not going to want to be able to, if you're driving this off a SharePoint list, you don't want to have to add items to your production list to test this. You want to be able to use a separate list. There are many other scenarios as well. Things that are variable amongst environments. You can use parameters to help you overcome that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a parameter. Let's go back to our Logic App. Let's go find our parameters. Here's our last Office 365 parameter. I'm going to add one at the end here. For email address, and then I'm going to go back to my parameters file itself and actually add that parameter. So that was the reference to the parameter in my Logic App. Here I'm going to actually add the parameter itself with the value, and there's my for production, that's the email address I want to use. So I can save that. I can save that as well. And then one last thing we need to do is to reference that parameter now instead of the email address. So I can simply go down here and replace my email address with a reference to the parameters. So if you look in here, you'll see 2 different formats of parameters, one with the @ sign and one without the @ sign. The one without the @ sign references or refers to the Azure template, the Azure management template parameters, not the Logic App parameters. So these parameters will get replaced when I deploy, whereas other parameters will be used at runtime. So let's save that and let's close the Logic App JSON file. And now if I wanted to, I can open that up in the designer. To use the designer, you have to be online. You have to be connected to your tenant. Let's try that again. There we go. let's try that again. Let's see, let's pick resource group and OK. And here's our flow. So you can see here the email I entered is invalid because it's using the parameter. We can ignore that. But here's the rest of our flow imported, the rest of our logic app imported from the flow template. So no changes required there. I already have the connections for these two things for the analytics and for the email already set up in this resource group. So I don't need to recreate those. So now I can go to deploy, and I can choose to deploy. Again, I have to pick the right account. And now you can see here that we've only got one logic app defined in the solution, so that's the only one to pick. Same with parameters. And I can click on deploy. When I do that, it's going to prompt me to give me the opportunity here to edit any of the variables that I'm using. I do have to enter a name for this logic app. So we'll just do demo logic app number 8. Let's try that. Everything else is there already, email address, etc. I can save, and it should, hopefully if things go well, it should deploy. And it's thinking about it. Yeah, let's try that again. Okay, we have the right subscription, right resource group. Looks good. Let's try again. There we go. Okay, so when it's all done, you'll see that it's successful. You can see that it used these parameter values. So you can see it's demo LA8, went to Central US. There's the connections for Application Insights and Office 365 and the email address we used. So if we switch over now to, let's go back into our Azure portal. And let's refresh and let's see if this shows up yet. There it is, demo LA8. If I open that up, I can go edit and see that my logic app is here. So now if we look at the email address here, we can see the actual email address because when we deployed, that's when that variable is referenced. It's pulled in, and that's what gets deployed here. So if, let's switch back here. And now let's say, okay, I want to be able to deploy to another environment. I want to create a dev, another resource group for dev. I can just go add a new item. I can pick Azure Resource Manager parameters file. I'm just going to leave that name the same and just call it dev. And let's go to this one. We're going to select, select all, copy, and we'll paste it in here, and then we'll just change this to use a different email address. And we'll save. And now let's deploy again. We're going to deploy to the same resource group just for simplicity, but we'll pick a different parameter file. And we'll click on deploy, and it's going to fail. Missing step. Okay, so if you do that, you do everything right, and you get to this point, and it's going to PowerShell script that Visual Studio ran is going to prompt you for information. That means you missed a step, and that step is our new template or our new parameters file. We haven't set the build action. So we do have to set that to content. And now we should be good to go. Let's do deploy. Logic app, and I think we're just about out of time. Let's see if this goes real quick. And there we go. And there's the address, the email address to use is the outlook.com email address. And that was successful. Okay, so that kind of shows you real quick how to be able to set your project up so that you can deploy to multiple environments. Really makes it easier. Then, of course, you have source control. You can check this in. It's JSON. It's just it's just like code. So you can check it in and version it in your source control system, just like any other project. So let's go back here. So in summary. Easy migration from Flow to Power Automate. I'm sorry, from Power Automate to Logic Apps. Logic Apps can be more economical. You can get around some of that licensing issues if you're using premium connectors. Much better story for application lifecycle management. And you can do anything from simple workflows to very complex enterprise integrations and orchestration. So we've got some resources there, and I am out of time. I am a minute over. So up next is Mark Beach. He's going to talk about Windows Virtual Desktop.